Hello, students. I'm back again with your module lecture 2, The Encounter. I just wanted to take a minute to apologize for the delay on the recording of this lecture video. Had some personal stuff going on, but don't worry, this shouldn't happen again. I hope that my slides at least helped you guys a little bit. And if you have any questions or concerns about your assignments for this week, please just let me know, okay? So today we're going to talk about the encounter. We're basically just going to discuss the cultures of the Iberian people, the Amerindian peoples, and African peoples before the colonization of Latin America. And we're going to talk about the conquest of Latin America. So that's what we're going to do for this lecture. So the Iberians have what is called a culture of conquest. I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase "for God, gold, and glory" at some point in your academic careers. God, gold, and glory aren't all reasons that all people seek to settle in the New World, but they are the reasons that all of the combined people who participate do so. Um, so the Iberian Peninsula in 1492 is pictured here over on the left. Well, it looks very different from what we know of the Iberian peninsula today, where you have a united Spain and united Portugal. In 1492, this was not the case. Your most powerful kingdoms, however, are Portugal, Castile, and Aragon. So just be aware that we're not talking about Spain as we know of Spain as today. Prior to 1492, the Iberians had been engaged in a centuries-long battle to retake the Iberian Peninsula from the Moorish invaders who arrived in the early 8th century, so the early 700s. This ends in 1492 with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella's army defeating the King of Granada. So Isabella and Ferdinand actually emerge as a stronger central government than Spain was used to having. Similar things are happening in Portugal, where the king, having led the military to reconquer the kingdom, has more power than previous kings. They also emerge truly believing that Catholicism is the supreme faith in the world. And they also, after completing the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, they're now ready to begin focusing on developing new trade routes to get access to spices and other luxury goods. Iberian societies were hereditary monarchies with high social, economic, and political inequality. So, for example, in Castile, the largest and most powerful of the kingdoms, the aristocracy represented 2% of the population but owned 95% of the land. That's highly unequal. The victory over Granada in 1492 offered new types of social mobility on the Iberian Peninsula, however. So rather than just hereditary nobility, the conquistadors are beginning to gain noble status through military valor and service to the crown. Now, when Christopher Columbus set sail under the Spanish flag in 1492, all of Europe is engaged in a hunt to find new markets, but also to find access to luxury goods. So when Christopher Columbus arrives at Hispaniola in 1492 and claims the Western Hemisphere for Spain, the Portuguese get pretty upset. And they go to the Pope, and the Pope says, hey, I'll draw this imaginary line through the world because I'm the Pope and I can do that. And everything on this side of the line will go to Portugal, and everything on this side of the line will go to Spain. So as you can see here, a map is marked with a line that becomes known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. And this line gives Spain the right to colonize most of the Americas, while Portugal is relegated to Brazil and Africa and Asia. So that's the Iberians. We're going to move on to the Amerindian cultures. We are mostly going to talk about the large empires, but before we do so, we're going to talk about how these people got to the Americas and how diverse they really were. So the first peoples in the Americas, most of them arrived across what is known as the Bering Strait, which was this area here that connected Alaska to Russia across the Bering Sea. And that migration started about 15,000 years ago. There are theories that some of the settlers in the New World, in the Americas, had actually come on these floating rafts across the ocean, but that would have been in much smaller numbers than this migration. Now, these Amerindian societies are incredibly diverse. So the West Indies, which, is the Latin America, whatever, is home to at least 15 different cultural centers. So like large capitals, right? And over 160 linguistic stocks. So 160 linguistic stocks doesn't even cover how many different dialects and maybe actual languages there were. So we're talking about an incredibly diverse group of populations. We can divide them more or less into three categories. The first category are sedentary peoples. So the Aztec Empire, the Aztecs, the Inca, they would represent these sedentary cultures that live in these permanent settled communities and practiced agriculture. They're able to form these large empires because they do practice this type of year-round agriculture. Then we have semi-sedentary peoples, and these are peoples who have temporary settlements during part of the year and migrate during other parts of the year. And so they would participate in agriculture during their settled seasons and then feed themselves on hunting and gathering for the rest of the year. Now, nomadic peoples are peoples that don't ever settle temporarily or permanently, and they move from place to place and rely heavily, almost exclusively, on hunting and gathering to survive. You find semi-sedentary peoples and nomadic peoples mostly in like the Amazon rainforest and areas like this. So the first group we're going to talk about is the Aztec Empire. So the Aztec Empire is ruled by the Mexica people. That is one group of indigenous peoples, the Mexica. And they established the city of Tenochtitlan here, the Aztec capital, in the 1300s. In 1428, the Mexica joined with some other powerful city-states, so like the Mixtec and the Tlaxcala, and they create the Aztec Empire. This lasts until 1519. Now, the government is set up so that the Mexica rule from Tenochtitlan, and the rest of the areas around trade some labor and some tribute for protection by the Aztecs. So that's how the Aztec Empire works. Mexica Society is also very hierarchical, similar to the Iberian culture. Nobles are believed to be semi-divine. Commoners include people like merchants, craftsmen, um, farmers. About 5% of the population were slaves. So slavery did exist in the Americas prior to the arrival of the Spanish and the Portuguese. However, slavery was very different. People would become slaves if they were part of a conquered people, for as punishment for crimes, for failure to pay a debt. And once their punishments were over, their debts had been repaid, or they raised enough money to purchase their freedom, they would be released from bondage. And their children were also not burdened by their status as slaves. Their children were born free. So this is markedly different from the slavery that will develop with the transatlantic slave trade. Mexico women maintain substantial rights and responsibilities. They serve as temple priestesses. They work as vendors, midwives, um, healers. They supervise market activities. They own possessions even once they're married, and they can pass them down themselves, decide who their possessions go to. So the Mexico women actually had more rights than many of the Iberian women, as we'll come to see in our next lecture. The Mexico religion is polytheistic, meaning they learn and believed in multiple gods. There's one god in particular who is the most important. It's Huitzilopochtli, and I have a really hard time saying it, so just laugh at me. That's fine. But he's the god of sun and war. He is believed to have led the Mexica to the city of Tenochtitlan. And it was also believed that he required a special serum that existed in human blood to continue his trip across the sky every day. And so that became, and so human sacrifice is a very important part of the Mexica religion, and they mostly gain their victims through conquest. Next is the Inca Empire. So the Inca Empire is located in the Andes Mountains in South America. It lasts from the early 1300s to 1530. By 1530, the Inca Empire stretched about 3,000 miles and contained about 9 million people. It also contained about 10,000 miles of parallel roads that transported goods between different climates. So you have the lowland Amazonian climate, you have the highland climates, and they're trading with one another within the empire. So Inca society is also hierarchical, but it exists based on this principle of Aini, which is a system of reciprocity in which members of society um, kind of scratch each other's back. And so there's supposed to be reciprocal relationship between family members, between community members, between individual communities, and also between individual communities and the king. This idea that we serve the king, but the king serves us as well. The Inca require a labor tax that's known as the mita. It's a rotating labor tax where each community would send so many people to work on building and maintaining roads in the empire, or fighting in wars, or completing agricultural work, or working in the mines. We have this system of labor rotation where every community contributes to the development and upkeep of the empire. Each social unit, so these are kinship groups, so they could be communities or part of communities. Each of them are going to claim an identity based on a recognized ancestor. This could be an actual person who lived and breathed, or it could be a mythical ancestor. So in the Inca religion, you also have a polytheistic religion, and their sun god Inti is also the most important. The Inca is said to be descended from Inti, so that's his kinship group. That's his mythical ancestor that creates his kinship group. Inti doesn't require human sacrifice to fulfill his duties as sun god. And so, while human sacrifice does happen within the Inca religion, it is not nearly as common or as central as it is for the Aztecs. And finally, the Maya. So the Maya were located in southern Mexico and Central America, mostly in Guatemala. And they began to form large settlements around 1800 BCE. So between 250 and 900 CE were the height of the civilization. Maya people participated in agriculture and constructed these giant cities. As you can see, there's some representations on this map here. And they practice a polytheistic religion. The Maya civilization as grand empires and city states begins to decline before the Europeans arrive. Um, Scholars haven't been able to pinpoint one particular reason for this, but there are a few. These include the environmental degradation that came with population growth in city centers, constant warfare with one another, overpopulation, like we're talking about, leading to environmental degradation, but also shortages of such basic items as food and clean drinking water. Drought could have contributed to the decline, but the stone city states kind of fell to ruin one by one over the 8th and 9th centuries. The Maya people did not disappear along with their massive city states, however. They continue to live in Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico, and Guatemala. And there are about 5 million Maya people who speak about 70 different languages and still live mostly in these small agricultural communities. Finally, here we have the Amazonian peoples, and we're going to be talking about them before the arrival of Columbus and the Portuguese. So the Amazonian peoples numbered about 8 to 10 million prior to the 1492 arrival of Columbus. Most of them are semi-sedentary, although some are fully nomadic. Semi-sedentary peoples, they practice what's known as slash and burn agriculture, which is cutting and burning vegetation in the forest to create space for planting crops and to fertilize tropical soil, which is not usually very nutrient rich. And some Amazonian peoples maintain their semi-sedentary and nomadic lives and remain isolated and semi-isolated in the Amazon forest. Now we're moving on to African civilizations in the early transatlantic slave trade. So the majority of slaves brought to the Western Hemisphere from Africa came from West and Central Africa. This region at the time was home to numerous states of varying sizes and varying degrees of power who are competing with one another. There are language and cultural differences that separate these peoples into hundreds, if not thousands, of separate ethnic groups. They've actually encountered Europeans prior to 1492. They had been trading with the Europeans sort of as equals for a while, mostly gold and some slaves. So the first we're going to talk about is the Songhai Empire. The Songhai Empire, as you can see here, was located in West Africa. Its capitals of Gao and Timbuktu were commercial and manufacturing hubs, huge cities. And they were also the centers of Islamic scholarship. Um, In the Songhai Empire, the ruler relied on the power of the military to maintain his control. Gold was a crucial trade item for the Songhai, and they did practice slavery. Slavery was not hereditary. They actually got slaves from military conquest and mostly used them for agricultural labor. Next, we have the Kingdom of Congo here in Central West Africa. It's dominated by the Bantu ethnic groups. Its rulers believed that having a relationship with the Portuguese would bring trade and prestige to the kingdom, make it more powerful than those surrounding it. But by 1600, the intense connection that happens between the Kingdom of the Congo and the Portuguese actually destroys the kingdom. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. In 1507, the king of the Congo, Alfonso I, converted to Portuguese and converted to Catholicism and allow Portuguese Catholics to come spread Christianity in the kingdom. As Christianity spread, the power of the Portuguese became relative to the power of the King of Congo increased, weakening the kingdom and making it vulnerable to attacks from surrounding kingdoms. Um, Another factor that's going to contribute to the fall of the Kingdom of the Congo is the slave trade, with its close relationships with the Portuguese. It's going to participate in the transatlantic slave trade, which will begin peaking in the 18th century and extract an unheard number of enslaved Africans from the continent. Um, it's far different, the transatlantic slave trade, from the slavery institutions of slavery that existed both in the Americas and in Africa prior to the conquest, because they're traveling such a far distance. They're being completely torn from their cultures, their languages, their homelands, their religions. And they're being stripped of all legal protections, meaning that hereditary slavery will be introduced. This was not the case in any prior forms of slavery. So, and finally, we're going to talk about the conquests of the Americas. So, the conquistadors are probably the first group we should talk about. So the conquistadors are going to finance their own expeditions to the New World. They're not going to be paid by the crown. They're not members of any recognized military force. These are people who are going for their own reasons to do this. So one of those reasons would be to raise their social status, to join the nobility because they've shown military valor and service to the crown. Another is to gain what are known as encomienda, or land and labor grants from the crown, or to be allowed to find other precious items such as gold and precious metals that they would find in the process of the conquest, to increase their personal wealth. As the brutal news of the conquest starts reaching the Americas, um, Europeans began to debate whether or not the conquest is actually a moral thing to be doing. And they also start to debate whether or not indigenous peoples are actually human. So in 1512, as indigenous labor is being exploited to the near extinction of the indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, the Spanish crown passes what's known as the Law of Burgos in 1512, which orders encomenderos to treat indigenous workers much more kindly. So it outlaws indigenous slavery, and it mandates that that indigenous peoples must be provided access to churches and clergy, and they should be paid for their labor in the gold mines. Of course, the encomenderos, who are wanting free labor and lots of wealth, are not going to enforce this. So in 1513, the Catholic Church creates a document that is supposed to help justify the conquest of the Americas based on the mission of these Catholic nations to bring the word of God to these savage peoples. So, and so the requirement in 1513 is going to mark the beginning of the major conquest of the Americas. It's going to be read at the beginning of every act of conquest in the Americas. It orders indigenous peoples to accept the Catholic faith and the Spanish monarchs, or face battle, enslavement, and death. And it becomes a justification for the violent conquest of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Think about it. They don't speak Spanish. So someone's coming and reading you this document in Spanish. You don't know anything about the Catholic Church. You don't know what they're talking about. So how can you agree, right? It's just basically a blanket statement saying that they wouldn't accept God, so we have to force them to, right? Now, the use of indigenous labor is going to have a very, very rough effect. I'm sorry, my brain's not functioning very well. The use of indigenous labor as well as disease is going to drastically reduce the indigenous population available for exploitation by Iberian settlers. So in 1501, to replace the indigenous labor that's being lost, the crown begins to allow encomenderos and settlers in the New World to import slaves from Seville, Spain. In 1518, the crown decides that we need more labor in the New World, and so they begin to allow the direct importation of slaves from Africa to fill the need for labor in these regions. Then we arrive at the fall of the major empires. So the fall of the Aztec Empire. In 1519, Hernan Cortez leaves Cuba, where he has helped conquer Cuba. He leaves Cuba, embarks on an expedition to conquer what will become New Spain and then Mexico. He enters through Veracruz, and he starts in the southern portions of Mexico, conquering Maya peoples there. There's a famous battle called the Battle of Tabasco. After this battle, which is very fierce, Cortez is given 12 indigenous women who become the first indigenous peoples in the Americas to be baptized. One is given the Christian name Doña Marina. Her original name was Malintzin, and she became the translator and the mistress of Hernan Cortez. They actually have a child together, Martin. She remains this very controversial figure in Mexico. We'll talk a little bit more about her when we get to ideas of honor. But she's portrayed as a traitor to the Mexican people for her role in translating and helping Cortez to conquer the Aztecs. But she's also recognized as the mother of the first mixed race Mexican, with both European and indigenous heritage. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we discuss ethnic nationalism later in the semester. So as Cortez and his army are marching, they come upon Tenochtitlan, and the ruler Moctezuma meets Cortez at the city gates. Cortez immediately captures him. They end up hearing rumors that the Aztecs are planning to kidnap them and kill them, and so they begin attacking attacking indigenous, the Aztec people who are participating in a religious ceremony. They sack the temples, they destroy sacred objects, and they replace these Aztec religious symbols with Catholic religious symbols. Legend has it that at some point Cortez takes Montezuma to the top of the temple to try to calm the fighting, and Montezuma is killed by a rock striking him in the head. There's no real historical kind of verification for that, but that's the legend. Um, so Tenochtitlan fell, but the final surrender of the Aztecs doesn't come until Cuauhtemoc, the last Aztec king, um, fully surrenders in 1521. So this does not take very long. In just a few years, this massive, massive Amerindian empire has been laid to waste by the Spanish. Next, we have the fall of the Inca Empire. So Francisco Pizarro is the conquistador who is credited with the conquering of the Inca Empire. So he landed at Tumbes, Ecuador in 1530. At the time, two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, were competing to inherit the Inca Empire from their father. In 1532, Pizarro actually captures Atahualpa, um, and slaughters like all of his army. And Atahualpa offers to pay him for his release, and Pizarro agrees. So Atahualpa pays him, and then Pizarro executes him anyway. As after the execution of Atahualpa, Pizarro begins his march towards Cusco, the Incan capital in Peru. As he's marching, the Incan army just kind of throws down their weapons and allows the Spanish to pass. They do not want to suffer the consequences of the war. Pizarro continues his conquest, attempting to conquer Chile, where he's unsuccessful. And when he returns, he finds that indigenous allies are in open rebellion against the Spanish mistreatment of indigenous women. So the Spanish crown brings in a new executive to try to calm down the region and protect indigenous people. By 1549, the Peruvian leader has had to take down many of the encomenderos who were rebelling against the crown. And at that point, they're able to focus on capturing the last Inca ruler, which remained at large until 1572. So not as easy a conquest as the conquest of the Aztecs. And finally, we need to talk about Brazil and the Brazilian counterexample. So Brazil doesn't, the Portuguese don't have any major conquest stories in their settlement and claiming of Brazil. In fact, initial relations between indigenous peoples and the Portuguese settlers are peaceful trade. Portugal is much more focused on developing colonies in Africa and Asia than in settling Brazil. So early trade are just iron tools, weapons, and other European goods in exchange for the major export that Brazil begins with, which is Brazil wood, a popular wood used to dye things red. Now, as indigenous people began to start to resist being exploited for their harvesting of this Brazil wood, the Portuguese began the process of enslaving indigenous communities. Later on, the creation of permanent settlements in northeastern Brazil focused on the cultivation of sugar is going to increase the enslavement of Brazil's indigenous peoples. But as indigenous peoples are destroyed by disease and, being overworked, um, the transatlantic slave trade, which the Portuguese control, begins to take off. Um, Brazil in this time can be considered a fringe area. The Portuguese haven't really established administration there yet. There are not um, a lot of connections um, to the colonial economy, or there aren't any very many valuable resources. And so, to be speaking Portuguese men often end up marrying indigenous women or living with them in concubinage. Remember, it's mostly just Portuguese men, they don't have many women, so they're just going to go after the indigenous women. And by the 1550s, there are enough Portuguese settlers in Brazil that the Tupinamba are just overcome by force and numbers. And that's all I have to say for your lecture on the encounter. And in order to not keep you all too long and to get this next lecture recorded so we don't have any other problems, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Thanks a lot. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.